Hello and welcome to ICANN Media. I'm your host, Rob Hislop. In our last podcast, we introduced you to a professor from the University of Waterloo, Roland Hall. Now, he did a study looking at the oil sands industry and concluded that it is not polluting the Athabasca Delta. Not surprisingly, the conclusions have been met with skepticism from many people. One of those is David Schindler, an acclaimed scientist in his own right who himself has studied the water in the oil sands region and certainly came to a very different conclusion from Hall. We contacted Schindler at his home in the Kootenays in British Columbia. We have him on the phone right now. David, thanks very much for joining us here on ICANN Media.
You're welcome.
Now, before we get your thoughts on this latest study, perhaps you can tell us a little bit about your background.
I have a PhD in aquatic ecology from Oxford University, and I spent 22 years as a scientist with the civil service, leaving as a senior scientist, followed by 25 years as a university professor, holding a chair in aquatic ecology at the University of Alberta.
And you yourself have done studies on the conditions of water in the oil sands region.
Yes, and I follow the literature very closely too.
And from what I have read, your studies certainly find that the oil sands industry is having an impact on the water in northern Alberta?
Yes. The best evidence is that the analyses of snowpack that we did in sampling in 2008, published in 2009 and 2010 in two papers in the Proceedings of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, followed by one with 2 additional years of work on mercury, which had almost identical patterns to what we found in snow done by Environment Canada. And since then, there have been studies of the distribution of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons in lakes, also done by Environment Canada with some Queen's University participants. They found that polycyclic aromatics that could be traced to the oil sands industry, i.e. they are not from natural sources, could be found in the sediments of lakes up to 100 kilometers away, beginning about 30 years ago.
So polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons are one of the main components of the bitumen that's being mined in northern Alberta. What else can you tell us about them?
They're a pretty poorly known group because we did not have good chemical technology to measure them at toxic levels until about the last 10 or 15 years. I think it's fair to say that this is one of the nastier groups of compounds that we know exist. One of them, for example, benzoapyrene, is the main carcinogen in cigarette smoke. It's one that's also represented in bitumen and in coal and many other things. I think most toxicologists and ecologists agree that because we know that some of them are very toxic, we should not be spewing them out over the landscape to affect human and animal health.
All right, let's talk now about Roland Hall's study and the fact that he has concluded that the oil sands is certainly not having an impact on the Athabasca Delta. Your thoughts on that?
Its conclusion is based on studies in the Delta. Now, that's 250 kilometers from the sources that I mentioned. And our sources could only detect those compounds falling in snow out to about 50 kilometers. And even the Environment Canada one with this recent technology could only go 100. So I don't think anyone would expect to find airborne stuff down there directly. Now, some of it that we documented is falling into the water, and it's going down there too. But to look for these in the Delta, in my view, is nonsense. The equivalent is wanting to find a needle in your house, and to look for it, you throw it first into a haystack. The sediments in that delta represent all of the sediments eroded from a 93,000 square kilometer catchment. So the 1,000 or so square kilometers that are receiving this airborne pollution are diluted 100-fold by these other sediments. No wonder we can't see them.
Is there anything at all that you see in this study that you find encouraging?
It's good news that the delta isn't polluted, but to conclude that industry is adding nothing to that area is complete nonsense.
When you looked at Hall's research paper, was there anything at all about the methodology used that perhaps you think is relevant? Because Hall says that he used new techniques to determine perhaps the base levels of metals in the water going back decades, and he says that that was instrumental when comparing it to current levels.
I would say that in this case, given where all those sediments have come from, it's like comparing a haystack to a haystack with a needle in it. And you need pretty good methods to find the needle. I don't think their new methods are that good.
So when it comes to a study like Hall's, or perhaps the ones that you've done that have reached different conclusions, I'm curious how you think the public is able to make some sort of sense of all this chatter.
This is the sort of thing that has to be sorted out scientifically. And it should be one of the tasks of this new AMIRA group to take all of this science and look at it closely and comparatively, and put out public statements as to what the state of affairs is.
You just mentioned the group AMIRA, of course, for people who don't know. That is the Alberta Environmental Monitoring, Education and Reporting Information Service. Now, back to Hall, he says he himself would like to use his methods a little bit closer to the mining region.
Where he should do it is in some of the same lakes that Environment Canada and Queen's University has. He should be working in those lakes if he wants to test the theory that nothing is coming out of those stacks that's harming ecosystems.
Now, Hall makes no secret of this fact, and that is that Suncor paid for his research. Do you have any concerns about that?
I don't think that bothers me so much. I think that if there are major flaws in the study, they're usually caught by peer reviewers. And if they're good peer reviewers, and if they're not caught by peer reviewers, they're usually caught by readers afterward. And science grinds on very slowly, and every theory that comes out is tested and retested. And in general, the ones that survive are the ones that are repeatedly tested and found to be right.
David, thank you so much for your time today.
You're welcome, Rob.
And in our next podcast, we're going to give Roland Hall a chance to respond to David Schindler's criticism of his study. That's it for ICANN Media this time around. I'm your host, Rob Hislop.